This Choircast podcast is brought to you by The Joy of Letting Go by Kevin Sweeney. When one of the great living mystics, Richard Rohr, writes, all great spirituality is somehow about letting go. Do we just skim by it and look for the next great quote? Or do we allow this truth to utterly change our relationship with God, humanity, and reality itself? And if we accept letting go as the key to transformation, the question becomes how? How is each life-altering step of the spiritual journey somehow about letting go? Well, my new book, The Joy of Letting Go, is the answer to that question.
Liminal. A word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest.
I'm just too lazy.
You're not lazy. You have 7 kids, man. You are not lazy.
Well, that's the truth. That's the truth. Yeah, wow. I took that be fruitful and multiply a little too literal. I was a literalist on that one.
You were a literalist on that one.
Word for word, baby. NASB, man.
Oh, well, how you doing this week?
I'm good. Getting ready. Work's busy, but going on a vacation next week, so I'm trying to get everything done to prepare for that, and I'm ready. We're going to the mountains, and yeah, we're going to have a good time. So
That sounds cool.
Yeah. How about yourself?
I'm a little bit tired today. I performed a funeral. Officiated a funeral service, and I'm a little bit like, my brain is a little bit fried and toasted from that one.
Yeah.
Well, did you dive into Ben Katt? What'd you think of Ben?
Oh, yeah. I really enjoyed that this podcast a lot. I felt like I related to him in a
I thought you would.
in a lot of ways. Some of our journey and some of what he's talking about, especially the stage of life I'm in. Kind of going through that midlife transition, and I really connected with it. What about you? How did it hit you?
Yeah, I thought his story was really applicable. Being a pastor and being, as he said, on the edge of the inside.
Yes.
I've never quite fit in to just be the denominational yes man. I've never found a denominational home until I found Congregationalism, because they're not so creedal. But I've had a hard time fitting in, and just when I talked with him about possibly bringing him on the show, because he reached out to me. He's like, I got a book, and it looks like our stories are similar.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk. We had a preliminary conversation. I'm like, man, he's into meditation. I'm into meditation. He's got a journey a lot like mine. And it's just, it was just really, I felt like I was talking with a friend that I've known for a longer time. And really, I was like the second conversation we've ever had. So it was pretty cool. I liked it.
And for someone to admit that, you don't hear a lot of people admit, I sat on the edge on how did he say it? The inside edge. Yeah.
I thought you would relate to that, because you had that, the not fitting into the denominational, but doing your own thing. And he was very effective as a church planter and pastor. And that idea of being a translator, taking the amazing stuff that's happening in your context and then trying to put it into language of expectations and all that for the denominational hierarchies and things. I was like, wow, that concept is really intriguing to me, being that translator.
Yeah. Where does the hero's journey come from? I can't remember. Like, I've always heard about that. Is that like Greek or is that Buddhist or?
It's like pulled from like the archetypical story things, and Ben mentions the author who kind of puts it to a like a modern book and says,
Yeah,
here are the elements of the hero's journey. So
yeah,
he mentions that modern author, and then he takes the hero's journey and then talks
yeah,
about that through the lens of spirituality, contemplation,
yeah,
identity, psychology.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I thought it was pretty brilliant, and I liked it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. How about we let people loose on this episode, and we'll see them on the other side.
Peace out.
All right, peace out. That's what I say. All right, well, Ben, Katt, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here on my screen today. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Tom. Thanks for having me.
That is awesome. I was appreciating your background. You were appreciating my background because I got some wood. You got some wood, and so this wood here behind me is actually 1932 lumber from a extension on this church that has been a building since 1872. And yours is pretty cool.
Mine's from just Home Depot.
It's just Home Depot.
But it is cool. I wouldn't be surprised if the brand name was like, the year that wood was actually used on the church. It's like 18 whatever, something like that, something cool. But yeah, it's covering up some cinder block, and I'm basically in my laundry room.
We can't tell because the magic is happening between two cameras, and we framed it perfectly. There's artistic magic happening right here, right now. And yeah, you've done a really cool job. I like your background there with some photos and stuff and whatnot. And we get to talk about your book today. I'm excited to talk about your book today, The Way Home, Discovering the Hero's Journey to Wholeness at Midlife. And I love the title, and I love the topic, and it really lines up with kind of the liminal living. But before we dive into what you've written, I'd like to know a little bit about who you are. What kind of soil has your life grown up out of that brought you here to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, each year there's more soil to explore. But where my mind goes with that question is, I think of my family. So my mom and dad, and I have 3 brothers. I don't have any sisters. So I think of the 6 of us living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then moving out into a kind of older suburb where as a child I had a lot of room to ride around on my bike with my friends and my brothers and, play pickup sports in the backyard and those kinds of things. But very kind of boy centric household, a lot of sports that we were into. But when I think of family, right alongside that is like faith was such a huge component. So had a lot of fun with my brothers, still do to this day. We do an annual trip. A lot of good humor in the family. And also right alongside that, like faith was a core aspect. So I grew up in the church, specifically the Christian Reformed Church, in which I was later an ordained minister for quite a while, and planted a church, I would say on the edge of that denomination, but through that denomination. And when I think back to my childhood growing up in the church I did, it really was a beautiful community, felt like a family. And so even later when I was discerning a call to ministry and thinking about where I go to seminary or divinity school, I just felt like, well, I got some theological differences. There's issues I disagree with where the denomination is, but I've been loved well here. And so that really kept me around for a while, which also made it harder to kind of leave ultimately. So there's that. And then I would say, added to that, I went to a school now known as Calvin University, which is affiliated with that denomination. So you can tell a big part of my life was kind of swimming in those waters or growing up in those soils. And I met my wife at Calvin University, then known as Calvin College. And we got married right out of college. And Cherie and I have been married for over 20 years. But I really would say our marriage, there's my whole upbringing, but I've been with her now longer than than I was at home, a few years longer. And so she is just such a formative force in my life, and has helped me become the person that I am, both actively and directly with her kind of her words and wisdom and guidance, and also in the ways that she's allowed me to grow and supported me as I've needed space to go on my own soul journey. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but that's where my mind goes now. And I'm a father of 3, so that's the freshest soil. I got almost 3. They're almost all teenagers now. It's a lot of teen energy and words, and a whole vocabulary I don't understand.
Yeah.
This slang, I'm trying to keep up with it.
I've had to learn,
but not use it myself.
Like, I've had to learn what yeet is. Mid, that was a new one for me. I'm like, wow, this is like a whole new language. I don't know how
mid I've used. Yeet, I do not know.
Yeet, that's when you chuck something. You're like, okay, that out of here, you chuck it, you yeet it across the room. I had no idea that's what that meant, but I heard my teenager drop that one on me, and I was like, whoa, okay, there's a new word I've never heard before.
I mean, that should have been a verb earlier. That's a great word.
Well, you said you planted a church at the edge of your denomination, and I kind of I can really resonate with like that. Like, I'm not in the center, but I'm not necessarily outside. I'm at the edge. What does that look like and feel like to be at the edge?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is initially, I would say that there was a particular stream of the tradition I was in that I resonated with most fully, and that would be this kind of transformational aspect, this idea that like we all, and the role of the church is to participate in God's renewal of everything. And so where I saw that in my denomination, which I experienced a lot of that in college, that's what I was drawn to. Those were my teachers and my guides. And I really wanted to plant a church that was centered on that, really embodying the way of Jesus, with an accent on social healing and seeking the well-being of the community in which you are situated. So it meant that issues like, maybe certain doctrinal rigor and perhaps also like a certain pietistic stream that was there, those weren't as accented in our community. Definitely there was like an emphasis on the inner life. And look, we're always doing theology, but I would say it was really practical theology, reflecting on who we are as the church, as we are interacting with our community. So one of the advantages of that is, or the interesting dynamics of being in that situation, it really helped that there was like a parent church that kind of ran interference in some ways, right? They dealt with more of the denominational stuff, and we were kind of under their umbrella, and there was just certain freedoms we had being on the edge. But ultimately, I think it caught up with me in terms of being someone who was a translator. Like, here I am in my local context, and then I got to go back to central command, so to speak, right? And you got to like translate what we're doing to sort of make sure that they're okay with it, because they have the power, they have the authority, and they supposedly are the ones who have the correct view on how things should be done and what should be believed. So there was definitely a lot of tension inherent in that position. But it was being on the edge like that. It's a place I would say that was just like ripe for spiritual growth. It's like a lot of growth happened in myself and the members of our community.
Yeah, I like your role as translator. I've never heard it put that way. Like, I'm here on the edge talking to the people on the other side of this line, but I'm also inside and kind of like taking the stories, the mythologies, the vocabularies, the theologies of my tradition and trying to translate it for them, and then taking these stories of how I'm interacting in, community and everything, and then translating it back to them. That is like a liminal space to occupy, where you're in the middle of like these two worlds. Was that difficult to traverse, like trying to live in two worlds? Did you feel like you had to lean on one or the other, or how did that go?
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking of, I think Richard Rohr talks about being on the edge of the inside. That's really where I viewed myself, right? So there, at that point, there was enough of a sense of value in the, the potentials of the larger organism or institution, you could say, that I was like, it's worth being connected to this thing. It makes sense. And this is what I come from. And by the way, these people have resourced us and supported us. But ultimately, I felt like where we, where our credibility came from was our neighborhood. It was like the place we inhabited, where most of our church lived in, sort of like a 10 by 10 block area. We were very much a neighborhood rooted church. That was our accent. So our serving and our relationships all revolved around that particular place. So yeah, definitely being in the liminal space, I would feel the intensity of it a couple times a year, mainly when I had these like larger meetings I had to go to. I would say on a day-to-day basis, really being responsive to the gifts, the needs of our neighborhood, and sort of what was emerging there. That was like the priority, and was very life-giving. Ultimately, by the way, I burned out later, so there's lots of reasons for that. It wasn't all amazing, but found a lot of life there. And so yeah, the difficulty was mostly in the having to go, in a lot of ways, felt like over time, just having to justify our very existence and our approach to ministry, which in a lot of ways I would say wasn't very radical. In my mind, it wasn't very radical, but to more of the traditionalists in our denomination, yes, it absolutely was radical. And we weren't, getting people converted to like John Calvin's like theological tenets. And that was an issue for a lot of people. It wasn't an issue for me.
When did you start to like feel that shifting inside of you? Like, I'm doing something good, but I'm also running dry. I'm starting to burn out. Like, when did you notice something going on?
Yeah. I mean, that kind of gets us into where my book opens, which is, I was about, I was probably 7-8 years into this church plant, and which meant 5 or 6 years into this community center we started. So the church was called Awake. I love that image still. It's like waking up to the kingdom of God, waking up to who we really are, waking up to our calling, all these things. But I, was a number of years into it. And one morning I was out running and I got to the top of this hill, and usually I would just like charge home. This one particular day though, it was like I stopped in my tracks and these words welled up inside of me. And it was, if you don't have your heart, you have nothing. If you don't have your heart, you have nothing. And I mean, I would say that it was totally a wake-up call, and ultimately it was like a call to adventure. It was an invitation to something new, because as I went home that day and started peeling back the layers, like I knew, it was like, wow, I'm totally burned out, and I hadn't realized it, right? It was like I was ignoring all the warning signs. And so that opened up this broader territory, where I started to peel back the layers and see, okay, even as I've been doing meaningful things, impactful work, you could say virtuous work, like there's a way that I've been going about it that was really wrapped up in a smaller version of myself. Like I was really about achieving, but guess what? It's easy to hide that when you have a really small church, right? I was about kind of like in terms of my own standards for myself, kind of this perfectionist streak, which again was easy to ignore because I was like in what was on the outside is just like a very messy, organic community. And then also I was just constantly performing to please people. And, you could say, who are those people? But even I think that's where the act of translating caught up to me, is because there was a performance that came with that. I had to go, to be in between. It's like, well, I got to wear this hat today and now this hat. And so, well, what are they thinking over here? And what are they thinking? So I had to really dig into those things. But all of that was sort of the beginning of, ultimately, the beginning and the end of my time as a pastor, though I wouldn't have said that at that point. My whole approach was always like, pastor in such a way that like, you're always going to be here. And also at the same time, pastor in such a way that you could leave tomorrow, meaning you're like equipping and supporting the people to do what they do and share their gifts and lead, and it's not all about you, right? And so it was about a year and a half after that, it was fairly clear that it was time for me to move on.
I like how you open up your book. You say there's a million ways to lose your heart, and then you kind of compare that to the way, capital W, of Jesus. And could you talk a little bit around like those two, that comparison that you do, like the million ways versus the way, and what that looked like for you?
Yeah. So a million ways to lose your heart, for me, that's a way of communicating this dynamic that it's easy in our society to look and say, like, at these kind of big dramatic and or tragic like falls from grace, and kind of say, oh, over there, that's the story of someone who's kind of lost it all, who's lost their heart, right? So spiraling into drug or alcohol addiction, or like financial ruin because of maybe deceptive behavior or an affair, or a dramatic injury or illness. Like all those things, we can point to those stories, and we actually they're very inspiring stories when the people like rise like a phoenix from the ashes, right? And reclaim this sort of new intensity and vitality in their lives. Like, we love that story. But part of what felt important to me is, like, in a lot of ways, I was doing everything right. I didn't, I had that morning, if you don't have your heart, you have nothing moment. It wasn't like a total crash and burn. Like, yes, I was burned out, but it wasn't like everything fell apart, at least not initially. And so for me, I really it's to say that there are a million ways to lose your heart is to invite people to consider the small, subtle ways that even if things on the surface of life like look good, maybe even the job's pretty good and the marriage is good, and like, you're on the sidelines at your kid's soccer game, or you're at their swim meet or whatever it is, and like, it's all good. We're smiling in our holiday card, but there's a underneath, maybe just underneath, or maybe a little bit deeper, there's this discontent or this sense of like, there's something more, like I'm living on autopilot, or wow, I like abandoned a dream or a calling that I had. I've just kind of left that behind and I won't even look at it. So that's the kind of thing I want to invite people to consider with the a million ways to lose your heart. And then, of course, yes, I say there's one way to get it back. I say that kind of provocatively because, yes, I'm aware that people schooled in the Christian tradition will be like, oh, the way, I know what that is, or I know who that is. And I'm not really trying to answer that question like singularly, like the way is Christ. I think what I'm trying to say is there is a pattern. You could maybe even call it the Christ pattern, right? But there's a pattern that goes throughout all sorts of religions and cultures and stories, this mythical pattern, which Joseph Campbell identifies as the hero's journey. And it is the one of, the way I frame it is leaving the familiar, falling into the unknown, and rising to wholeness. And that for anyone who wants to live a fuller life, anyone who wants to be more free, anyone who wants to get their heart back or become more whole, like, it's going to have those elements and even some sub elements to each of those categories.
I like that hero's journey description and how you broke your book up into those three different categories. Who is your favorite hero in, whatever story you want to pick, whether it's literature, movies, or whatever, and why are they your favorite hero?
Okay, so 3 are coming to mind, and I'll name 2, and then I'll probably share the third. So I think of I talk about some of the Marvel movies because I was in a season of watching all those with my son when I was writing the book, and even before that, going through this experience. But I really like Doctor Strange, and the reason I like Doctor Strange as a hero is because I relate to this story. Here's this super successful doctor, he's like a hot shot, and he's got it all, and then like he gets in this car accident, and like the one thing that was his superpower, which is his hands, right? As like a surgeon, his hands are like shattered, and so there's like a whole new way that he's got to he goes on this soul quest and discovers other powers that he has. So I like that. I like Jean Valjean from Les Mis. There's a lot I like about that. This sort of just a great story, like redemptive character, in my opinion. And then what I come to answer that question is I'm a big fan of The Alchemist, and with Paulo Coelho's book, and it's like sold a gazillion copies. But Santiago, the shepherd boy, I kind of like saying, that's an incredible hero, in part because it's, we're not talking about superpowers, and we're not talking about like the Hugh Jackman Hollywood lead character. We're talking about a boy who's got a lot of life ahead of him, and yet there's this searching, this dreaming. I also like that it starts in southern Spain, and I have a huge, heart for Spain. But I love this story of, ultimately the twist at the end. Spoiler alert, you've had 20 years to read it or something like that, by the way. But he goes to the pyramids where he's going to find the treasure, and he gets to the pyramids, and someone's like basically tells him of a vision or dream of a treasure buried beneath, an altar or whatever in a church, I think is the story. And it's right back where he came from. So he goes all the way home, goes all the way back home. And I don't even pick that story apart or examine that in depth in my book, but there's certainly a parallel there. It's like, I sort of felt like I had to leave everything. And ultimately, when you go on the journey, what are you discovering? It's not like power and wealth and success. It's like, no, you're becoming acquainted with the core essential you, and which is like your home. And it's always been with you. It's just, we get estranged from it.
Yeah, you find yourself when you're outside of that autopilot mode, when you're outside of that, just going through the motions. And I know that like those are liminal spaces. When you leave the familiar, you step out into like that unfamiliar space, and like it can happen in like a really like planned way, like going on a retreat or something, getting away from your normal, and you go on a retreat or a conference or something, and you like learn new things about yourself and new information, and then you like bring that stuff home. Or it can also happen in like tragedy or suffering, where it hits you and now you're outside of your familiar. And both of those are liminal spaces that are just really transforming. Why do you think that it's so crucial to leave the familiar on the hero's journey in order to regain the heart?
Yeah. Well, there's always this sense of, I was just talking to someone this morning who's like quite well off, like financial advisor, and he is, he's exhausted, and he's totally stressed and burned out, and he knows he wants to leave, and he's kind of like, I'm kind of just waiting for them to fire me, is what he said. And he was sort of laughing about it. But I was, as we were reflecting together, it's like, what's always often more intimidating for us is the unknown. Like, because we can say, oh, I'm leaving behind. It would mean leaving behind this, and this, maybe status or wealth or a certain relational arrangement or whatever the thing is. I'd have to leave that behind. I'd have to let go of that. I don't know that I want to. But what we're not able to calculate in that moment is, it's the cost of staying, the cost of letting go, which is like, what will we not discover about who we are, and maybe what our gifts are, and new ways of being and showing up, and relationships and trust, like all these things that only come when you let go. So, coming back to your question, it's like for you to hold on to anything, when we hold on to something, we're not able to receive what's coming our way. There are things you can only receive when you let go. And that's sort of the great mystery. It's like this mysterious equation that's at the center of growth and evolving and changing and becoming more whole, is the more you want to stay attached, right? You think of especially like Buddhism, but this idea of attachment is something that's commonly talked about, or, these clinging. But the more you cling to something, then you can literally visualize it with like hanging on like a trapeze bar. Well, if you cling to that thing and you don't like let go and trust yourself and soar, you're never going to be able to grab the bar or be received by the hands there to catch you. So, it's amazing how I think we all have these moments in our lives where we say, whether it was a intentional and a chosen transition or letting go, or it was the one that came, as you said, say something more tragic or unexpected, we're able to look and say, ooh, we don't necessarily know if we would do it all over again. We're a little quiet on that question sometimes. But we're like, I only would have learned this, or I only would have discovered this. Or like I only discovered because I let go, because I left that thing behind.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned kind of that Zen Buddhism concept of attachment, and do a lot of funerals for our community. That's one way I serve the community around here. And towards the end, I call it the prayer without words, where I have them close their eyes, and then they bring to mind a memory of the loved one that they lost, and then I have them make a fist and clench it. And I said, now once you get that image in your mind, squeeze your hand a little bit tighter. And I said, there's things we got to hang on to, memories, mementos, and, the essence of who they were to us. We got to cling tightly to these things. But we also have to let go of some things. And so I have them take a deep breath in, and then when they exhale, I have them open their hand and imagine their loved one like leaving the palm of their hand and ascending. And in that moment, I said, there's some things that we need to let go of. Because the very act of letting go is the thing that will allow life to come back in our possessions, because we cannot receive something in a closed hand. And
that's beautiful.
That's something I close every funeral with that. And I quote Mary Oliver, because she's amazing, the poet Mary Oliver. And I say, she said, if you really want to live, you have to learn how to do three things. You have to learn to love that which is mortal, that which can die, and to hold it to your bones, knowing that your entire life and happiness rest on this person's presence in your life. And the third thing we have to do in order to learn how to really live is when the time comes to let it go, let it go. And then we do that open hand practice. And every single funeral I do that. And whether it's atheists or agnostic or loosely Christian or devoted fundamentalist Baptist, they all connect with that thing.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. Everything in our lives. This is very Ecclesiastes, right? But there is a season, a time for everything. But you really think of like an umbilical cord. It has a crucial purpose. It has a crucial purpose until it doesn't anymore. And you have to be severed. The cord has to be cut for that, that child to find sustenance in other ways and thrive and make it in the world. You can't stay connected. It becomes toxic. So this is how, the art becomes, and I think this is the core aspect of spirituality, whatever tradition, is learning to detect, or we could say discern, right? This moment of when is something no longer relevant, or when is it expired? I think culturally, probably we, maybe especially if you look at relationships, but we're a little too quick now. We're not very good at, like, we want to just like run away and leave it behind and be free. And, this is where like faith communities are so important and powerful and play a really critical role still. Is like, there's this other way. It's like, what if we say we belong to one another? And what if we make commitments? And what if there is accountability and we don't like run at the first sign of something being a little scary, or something is going to call forth a commitment from us, right? But the art really is, there's art, and obviously it takes wisdom, but we have to learn to let go. And guess what? Then where do we find ourselves? Right where you're always talking about, this liminal space. And then we arrive somewhere, and guess what? then that arrival is a new departure, and then we're in, the cycle continues.
Mm-hmm. That's why I like it. The name of this podcast is Liminal Living, because if you really look at the nature of life, you never arrive. Like if you learn how to live in the moment where time is like passing through your fingers like water, and not to live in the past where you have all these regrets in the past, and not to live with all these anxieties about the future, but to bring yourself and recollect yourself into this moment and live in this moment. You're always transitional and you're never arriving. You can find stability, which I think is important. Psychologically, we need things that are stable. But if you really look at how life operates and how humans operate within the stream of time that we call, our life timeline moving forward, we're never arriving. We're always in transition to something. And then we have to, like psychologically, we have to make constructs of, things that are very concrete, and then make like a house to live in the present moment. But if you really take away all of the mental constructs of how we attend to this moment in time, like all of it they're just mental constructs, but the reality is we're living in transition, in transit, like all the time, never arriving. And like learning how to be here in this present moment is, I think, what spirituality has to teach us, is how to be here and now and in the present moment with as much love as we can muster. I think that's the best thing we can do.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I resonate with that 100%. I mean, that's where in my own journey, where I say, well, what did I arrive to? It's really this place of stillness is what I talk about. I mean, wholeness, one of the ways of understanding that, as I see it, is stillness, which to me means it is that being here and now, as you're talking about being in the present. But stillness is that centered place that's between squandering and striving. So to squander it is it's to live in the past and to cling to something and say, oh, if only we could go back there. Things were better back then. And there's a sense that when you're squandering, it's like you're burying a treasure instead of like using this thing you've been entrusted with. And then to strive, and this is where I've found myself, and I would say, I was going to say culturally, I think we actually live in both those spaces. So, but in my own story, this sense of striving, which was like always looking ahead and onward and upward and more, and you see it in our cultural narrative, like bigger, faster, stronger. But that striving, again, pulls us from the present. So stillness is being in the present, and as you say, that's not stagnant. It's dynamic, and it just means that it will then call forth, when we're in that still place and present place, we're able to be aligned, especially as the more we practice stillness, in a sense, we're able to be aligned with like, what is mine to do here and now? What's the need of this moment? What's the decision that needs to be made? And we end up operating just according to a different pattern, you could say, that is less about all those constructs we've created, as you're talking about, which can be helpful and serve a purpose. But instead, we're more fluid. And we could see even like almost the fleeting nature of all those things, so that we can cooperate with the flow of our own lives, as opposed to, again, squandering or striving and pulling ourselves, out of the present moment.
Yeah, I like that. Like cooperating with the flow of our lives. That's a really good phrase. Now, the second third of your book, as you call it, falling into the unknown. And how would you differentiate, for our listeners who haven't read the book, leaving the familiar with falling into the unknown? Because they both kind of, have that unfamiliarness, that unknown. How are they different from one another?
Yeah, I think that leaving the familiar it's that process of you realize that. So I say there's a call to adventure, but there's this sense of there's a fuller, freer version of yourself. There's more. There's something beneath the surface, and you're being invited to embark on a quest. And you don't necessarily know where it's headed. You just know that where you've been, there's something that isn't working anymore, right? Something's maybe expired or it's expiring. So that's that first season, but it really ends with a decisive moment where there is a letting go. Now, you can be in this stage of leaving the familiar, and if you keep noticing there's something you need to let go of, you need to let go. I need to let go of it, but forget it. Like, I'm gonna go back to what's comfortable, what's familiar, what's sort of safe, right, or secure, or at least has the illusion of those things. Well, ultimately, I think we see in life what ends up happening is that resistance to what needs to emerge, like there's a course correction, like something happens, right? Or there's some more dramatic way that our soul or that life or say God, like the universe wants to get our attention. So we're kind of shaken out of our comfort zone so that we can have the courage to leave the familiar, okay? So that's a bit about that. But now, so the falling into the unknown is on the other side of like that decisive moment, whether chosen or sort of forced, you could say.
Yeah. Okay.
It's on the other side, and it's where it doesn't mean, the thing is, you haven't arrived yet. You're not to the quote unquote new destination or to the discovery of the thing you need to learn about yourself or whatever that might be. You're in this is the very, very liminal space. You're in the in-between. It's the wilderness, it's the darkness. And you are disoriented because you've realized that what used to work for you, how you used to show up, it doesn't work anymore, but you don't yet know what's taking shape in you. And that for me, letting go of roles and identities, that it's a very difficult place to be in, because even you start to question kind of everything. How was it that I lived like that for so long? Will I ever find a way forward? So that's what the unknown, and it lasts a long time. I'll say that. Like, it's different for every person and whatever the issue is, but I think we like the narrative of like, oh, I leave and then I arrive. I actually write this in the book. Like Lord of the Rings, the movie, you get the impression that like Frodo leaves the Shire like almost immediately after like getting the ring. But if you look in the book, it's something like, I think it's like 14 years. Like, it's a long time. Yeah. And I think in life that is, things last a bit longer. Like we're in that season of the unknown, longer than we anticipate.
It's funny you mentioned Lord of the Rings. It happens to be my favorite hero is Frodo, going on the journey and coming back. And I find it really interesting that I love Peter Jackson's rendition of the movie. They're amazing. But when I read the final book, I noticed that like the movie ended halfway through the book, and I'm like, there's a whole other half of the book here. I wonder what's going to happen with this, because I watched the movie first and then I did that, and I'm like, there's a whole other half of book. What's going to happen in this half of the book that's not even covered in the movie? And it's about Frodo coming back home, and Merry and Pippin and Samwise, and how they have a hard time fitting back in. Like, yes, they do this big heroic save the Shire kind of a moment, but they have a hard time fitting back in to the home that they left behind. And oftentimes, like, the hero returns home and they find that they just don't fit into the larger whole of like the social identity of the people or the conformity that they're doing. So how does one cultivate community when you've gone through radical transformation and, maybe you're on the edge of the inside and now you're on the outside? How do you then return back home and find community in that?
Well, I love that you bring that up with the book and the movie, because yeah, one of the things I thought about as I was writing The Way Home is that most movies, when you watch them, the return of the hero, right, or like after the climax or after the treasure's discovered or the person's rescued or whatever it is, it's like 2 minutes at the end of the movie. But if you really sit there and think about it, you're like, what about like, how is this going to work out now? Like, the example, it's sort of ridiculous. I ended up watching the Mad Max, not like the old Mel Gibson ones, but whatever the one is, Fury Road because there's a new it's not like it's a franchise I'm super into, but it's like, I felt like I want to watch cars drive across the desert. So, anyways, like they end up reclaiming the thing called the Citadel, where there's fresh water and there's like all these essentially like slaves. And like, I'm like, how are they going to run this society now? Like there are massive challenges for them to figure out. But of course it's like, no, the movie's over, right? We don't have time for that. So yeah, which is what, in my book, I was like, there's the whole back third is about, there's one chapter is called The Return Home, but it really is what the back third is about. This rising to wholeness is like, what does life look like now? And specifically as it pertains to community is, when you go on this inner journey, which is unique to every single person, and yet there's this universal pattern behind it, there's common themes. The truth is that like, most people aren't going to understand it. They might see on the surface of your life there's been shifts and things have changed and you're showing up differently. But not everyone, most people aren't going to know actually that internally you feel so different, and internally you're aware of like the treacherous terrain that you've had to cross. Okay. So that makes it very difficult then to just sort of, like you said, to re-enter. It's not smooth. It's not easy. I think there's a few important considerations. One is, you might come back from the journey and realize, like one of the discoveries is you need some new boundaries in your life. And there's certain people with whom you're in relationship that either maybe you've given too much power, you've relinquished something of yourself to them, and you're going to need some new boundaries. And so there's going to be a rearrangement of relationships. Some relationships might be brought to an end. Okay. You might realize it's time to actually leave a community. Maybe it's a faith community that's meant so much, but for you to keep growing and stay in tune with your soul and live with integrity, you have to leave, as hard as that's going to be. If that's the case, make sure you're not just like judging your former self for being a part of it, or you're not too hard on that thing, right? Now, the other thing that happens is along the way, it's likely you will find some, maybe one, maybe a few, but like anamkaras, soul friends. Those are people, and they might be more dispersed, so it might not be in your local context, but if you found those people, those are going to be critical companions for your continued journey. So it could even be like your spiritual director or something like that. Now, the other consideration is, I think ultimately, I would say you are coming home to yourself. And so this doesn't mean you don't need community, but all the things that maybe your smaller self sort of desperately needed in terms of relationship, there's a new kind of self-sufficiency that comes from within, and a groundedness and at-homeness in oneself, which, again, this doesn't mean you don't need relationships, but it gives you a patience and capacity to wait, right? So that you're not coming back with this urgency of like, I need new friends now, or I need a new community now. There's a sense that over time, it's going to reveal itself. So, those are a few ways that I like to think about that question, but it is really important. It's a really important consideration.
Yeah, I like what you need relationships for changes after that. Like how you mentioned that how you're using relationships now is going to shift and change, and that I found that like I really have a small group of those anamkara type friends that are those soul friends that I really connect with, and they're geographically like dispersed all over the nation.
Yes.
Thank you, technology, for connecting people. And one of those soul friends I've actually never met in person before. We just got connected through spiritual direction. But he's my friend Paul in Alabama. But it's just really cool how technology can connect us to these like-minded people. That's really interesting. I like that thought. What are some practices because that's hard to get to that place, and when you're in the unknown and unfamiliar, you need things like to cling to sometimes. What practices have helped center you on the journey?
Yeah, I mean, the most impactful practice for me, we've talked about this a bit offline, but is meditation. So I teach meditation. I teach meditation because meditation has been absolutely transformational for me. And so, there's a whole host of styles and, meditation technologies, you could say. I find that it's just such a game changer in terms of maintaining that sense of being internally referenced as opposed to being externally referenced. So
like
it
that.
continues every day to be, in a sense, a way of returning home to myself. But it's those deeper layers. So it's really something, it's like big self. It's God. It's universe. It's a bigger dynamic rather than being externally referenced, which then often can get us caught up in small self, which is they say I'm this and I'm supposed to be that to fit into this thing. So meditation, absolutely. And I would say along the way, and I outline a bunch of these practices in the book, but journaling continues to be really, it's fun. I like writing. It can evolve every day in terms of what that journaling actually looks like. I just know for myself, I've learned that it needs to be, it's more beneficial when it's about going inward instead of going forward. Like I can get in the mode that's like dreaming and scheming and trying to figure out this or that. There's a time and place for that. But in terms of like my sort of sacred journaling practice, it's about going inward, going downward, digging into the depths of who I am. And then also I absolutely would, need to mention just wandering in the wild, like being on a trail or out at a park. There's all sorts of forms that wandering could take, but really engaging the wild world, engaging nature, and just opening myself up to how it might speak to me and what it might want to teach me about who I am and why I'm here.
Very Celtic. You got like a Zen Celtic Christian monkness going on to your vibe. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I feel like part of this journey just kept opening me up, and being on the inside edge of an institution, as I talked about earlier, I think there were ways that I restricted myself. And I can go back to like middle school or early high school. I can picture myself I went to like the world religions aisle at the public library. And I'd be like, what about that book? And what about this? And I would like read these things. And I had this curiosity. And then at some point I was like, oh no, maybe just this shelf, or maybe just this one book or this book of books. Right. And so it's been part of the gift of the journey is like opening up to all these other wisdom traditions. And there's definitely still like Christianity, or there are Christianities, but right, the Jesus tradition or tradition of traditions is so formative for me and filled with so much beauty and wisdom and truth. And also being familiar with that has helped me understand the depths of wisdom and knowledge that these other traditions also carry.
That's amazing. Well, I love your story. I love this book. And where do you want to send folks to purchase this book? What's the best place?
Yeah, so you can get it really anywhere. You can get it on Audible or Spotify. If you have Spotify Premium, it's like, I think you get it for free if you want. But I would just say go to thewayhomebook.com. That'll take you to my website. You can learn more even about like meditation and coaching and other things, but you can get some nice jumping off points for getting the book for yourself. But yeah, thanks for reading the book and spending time with my stories and for having me on your podcast.
Man, it's been a pleasure, and looking forward to connecting some more in the future for sure.
All right, Tom, be well.
I didn't bring back the Samuel L. Jackson scale on this one, but
No.
that's all right. We'll bring it back for Peter Rollins.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, we just had Ben Katt on this show, and I thought that was pretty great, inspiring story. He's kind of telling his story from a liminal place where he's not landed like in the spot. He's really in that transitional, I'm no longer a pastor, but I'm doing all these like side hustles to try and reform myself into a new identity kind of a thing. And I thought that really fit the liminal atmosphere here. That was pretty cool. I like this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was really great. Yeah, I mean, he brought out some really good points about attachment and fear and things like that. That you know, just kind of, it was very contemplative. He called out the illusion of the attachments and even the illusion of the process of this is not going to be easy, and spoke personally into that too. And
Yeah.
I really think this conversation, especially in the time of deconstruction and all that, I think we need to hear more voices like his because, I think he just brings an authenticity to it that was really good.
Yeah, he's talking as one who's on the journey. He's not talking from a ivory tower where he's achieved everything that we've all ever dreamed of. He's doing the courageous hero's journey himself, and not 10 steps ahead of everybody. He's a guide for people who are in the midst of it, because he's in the midst of it, so he knows the landscape really well. And those practices of like meditation helping us be internally referenced as opposed to externally referenced, that's a really simple way to sum up what meditation's helping you do. I just sit and be quiet, and then I tell other people to sit and be quiet, and I'm not really sure how to explain it, but that whole internal external reference system thing, I was like, man, that's really genius.
Yeah, you can tell he's lived with it and digested it. And continuing, but to be able to put it in that not simplistic and easy form, but just, I think my teenager could understand that on some level, and that can be difficult to do for a contemplative or a mystic.
Sometimes we don't even know what the heck we're talking about. Because there's no words. He had some good words. All right. Well, thanks for listening to this episode. Thanks for joining me and Paul on this journey. And do all the things you do to boost the algorithm, subscribe and like and share and all that jazz. And definitely go check out Ben's webpage and his book. There's some links down in the show notes for you to check that out. So, we'll see you next week. We got Grace Ji-Sun Kim talking about When God Became White.
Oh, that
book blew my mind, I tell you. That was a good one. So we'll see you next week for that one. See you next week, Paul.
Peace out, man. I'm going to steal your line again.
All right, you stole it. I'll let you steal it. I know. I'll see y'all later. I'll steal your line.
There you go. Have a good one.